Hi, everybody. My name is Nani Vishwanath, and I am a people team manager at a company called Limeade in Bellevue, Washington. We're an employee experience software company, and I'm really excited to dig into this concept of accountability and anti-racism with you all today. I want to start here. Before talking about anti-racism broadly, I wanted to share a story. If we think back to a few months ago, this June of 2020, after the murder of George Floyd, the nation and the world was really abuzz with conversation about racism, racial justice, diversity and inclusion, racial anything, right? There was so much conversation, including this real focus on anti-racism. It felt like every person and every company out there was trying to make a statement, or there was something they needed to say in this moment. To me, it felt like a mad scramble almost. We were in the thick of quarantine at the time, and I was spending a lot of time on my phone reading these statements and really trying to understand what people were saying, and truthfully, a little dubious of some of them. One of the statements that I came across was from Lululemon. This commitment on their site, which remains on their site today, is really about their commitment to inclusion, diversity, equity, and action. It has lots of different ways that they want to stay engaged in this moment, including hiring, education, adding more folks of color, developing teams, doing anti-racism task forces. They wanted to do and do and do to make change. This was similar to many sites that I saw at the time, and maybe many of you did too. But what does that really mean, right? What does that actually mean when they want to commit to anti-racism? Sort of coincidentally, on that same visit to the site, I came across, oops, hopefully that works. I don't know what I just did. I came across this, here we go. So if you can't see that, what that is a line of underwear that Lululemon was sharing or selling called the Namaste Put underwear. Now, for folks who may not know, Namaste is an ancient Sanskrit term from India, meaning quite literally, I bow to the divine in you. It's a Sanskrit term, it's sacred in nature, and it really is about a respectful greeting from one person to another. I am Indian myself and come from South Asian roots, and so this concept of Namaste, which we often hear in yoga practice, has a personal tie for me. And often in the yoga culture in America, it doesn't really feel like I see myself as an Indian person represented in yoga classes, yoga apparel, yoga stores. So it has a certain tie for me and a certain trigger for me, I would say too. So what does it mean to have this ancient cultural term deeply rooted in race with this? So like any other millennial, I sent them a DM on Instagram. And I asked them, how does this concept of putting an underwear line with this name really commit to diversity, equity, inclusion, or anti-racism at all? You're saying this is your commitment, but this is what you're selling. And I really wasn't expecting a response, but to my surprise, they did respond. I know I wasn't the only person who reached out to them, but we got into a back and forth, and it was respectful and actually quite a great conversation where I really called out what I thought was hypocrisy in this moment and an opportunity for change. So what ended up happening was actually really interesting. They ended up removing the name. They ended up changing the name of that line in this moment to not include that terminology anymore. And the picture here that you can see is that they've actually gone on each pair of those underwear in the store and put this new label to cover it up. And what's even better is that they're actually having a conversation with the brand about removing Sanskrit terms from their products altogether. So what does this have to do with anti-racism, right? What does this have to do with actual change? What it means is for anti-racism, you can't just add on things. You can't add on committees, education, trainings, task forces. You have to undo too. Because when we're in a system that is racist in nature, what we are surrounded in has problems existing already. So what can you do and what can you undo to actually address racism? Angela Davis shared this monumental quote: "In a racist society, it is not enough to be non-racist. We must be anti-racist." To be non-racist, you just continue to do in a racist society, right? You just act not racist. But to be anti-racist is not only to do, but to undo what racism already exists in the society itself. And it's a conscious, continuous, and intentional commitment to that work. So in the Lululemon story, they continue to do, right? They were saying, I'm going to add these sorts of trainings and education and hiring will have more diverse people. But what they needed to do was actually undo some of what already existed. So how does this apply to you? How can you uphold anti-racism in your own workplace or community? Here's a question that you could consider. First, you have to identify what is already existing in your society that's racist in nature. So a question you can ask yourself in any given situation is, which norms, perspectives, and values are considered legitimate? Is there a race associated with those norms, values, and perspectives? In the case of Lululemon, which I just described, the more whitewashed, say, version of yoga culture was what was the norm that was upheld. So when you think about situations in your workplace, which race embodies those norms? I want to share a couple of examples that we've sort of tossed around with my workplace about what this could look like in a work setting. And what are some simple systems, policies, practices, or even cultural norms that could have some racist tendencies deeply beneath? The first example, company credit cards. Imagine that your workplace doesn't use company credit cards and they instead ask employees to pay up front, or even some candidates to pay up front and then be reimbursed a week or two later. The assumption here is that the norm, right, is that all employees can handle this payment up front. How is this about race, you might ask? Let's take a look at the median household income of Seattle, where I live, where white families have an average median income of $105,000 a year, and Black families have $42,000 as their median income. So could this simple financial policy at a company negatively impact Black employees over white employees? It absolutely could. So in this situation, what would you do and what would you undo? To do or to not be racist, as Angela Davis said, would be to continue in this existing structure, this way of being and the norms that are at hand. Maybe you would look for a workaround. Maybe you would offer a colleague if you could help pay that for them, existing in what was already in place. But to undo is to change the system altogether. To undo is to engage in deep discussion with your financial leaders about why this is a problem. To undo is to remove this policy and get everybody access to company credit cards. To undo is to make the system more equitable altogether. Here's another situation, a little bit less tangible, more broad, cultural. Let's say at your workplace, there's annual company awards, and you notice that the folks who are getting the awards are loud, confident. Maybe they interrupt or speak out of turn. And they're looked at in your company as leaders, trailblazers, models of success. Does that resonate for anybody else? This style of verbal contribution is recognized as success, right? This norm is what's looked at as a leader. So again, let's ask this question: which norms, values, and perspectives are considered legitimate here? Well, is there a connection to race? We know in research that people reward linguistic styles similar to their own. So if you had a largely white leadership team who had a certain way of talking, which might be that loud, confident presence, they may reward folks who have a similar linguistic style to their own. We also know that people of color have different approaches often to speaking up in the workplace. Some Asian cultures, like my own, it's very disrespectful to speak up out of turn or to command an entire room when it's not really the right time. Whereas for another culture, that might be seen as bold. For my culture, it's seen as rude or uncalled for. And we also know that people of color also are afraid to speak up in many situations at work for fear of being stereotyped or pinned as a representative of their race. So when we're rewarding folks who show up a certain way, could that be connected to race? So again, what will you do and what will you undo? To do in this situation, to be not racist, would be to continue in this framework altogether. Maybe you notice that there's a correlation between race and success and you say something offhand to a colleague, or maybe you find a way to recognize your colleagues of color outside of this big annual event. But to undo is to change the system altogether. To undo would be to dismantle what success and leadership looks like at your company. To undo is to really make lasting change. So I really just want to ask you all, as you move forward in your workplace, in your communities, in the society that you're a part of, what will you do and what will you undo to dismantle racism, and what everlasting change will you make? Thank you.